Okay, so we just saw that when we have more O2 present, we're going to have a greater formation of oxyhemoglobin. When we have less O2 present, we're going to have less formation of oxyhemoglobin. Um, that can be described quantitatively in this function right here, which we refer to as the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay. So basically what's being shown here is how much oxyhemoglobin we get for different values of PO2, okay? But before we really get into it, what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus on this y-axis value, hemoglobin saturation. I want to explain to you what that means, and then we'll come back and take a closer look at this curve, okay? Hemoglobin saturation is the amount of O2 bound over the maximum amount that could be bound, okay, times 100 to get your percent saturation of hemoglobin. In other words, it's how much oxygen is bound divided by the number of available binding sites, okay? So, reminder, hemoglobin has 4 oxygen binding sites. What you're looking at here is each circle represents a hemoglobin molecule, and then each quadrant is going to represent one binding site on that hemoglobin molecule. Okay, if we look here, we can see that each hemoglobin molecule has 2 oxygens bound to it. Okay, so these little purple guys are oxygen. Okay, and then we have 2 empty sites, right? So half of the binding sites are occupied, which means that we have 50% saturation, okay? Now that I've covered that principle, I want you to practice with it, okay? So we have this figure right here, same sort of schematic. What is the hemoglobin saturation in this case? So go ahead, hit pause, do that calculation, and then you can unpause. Okay, so the hemoglobin saturation is going to be 95% in this case because we have 19 occupied sites over 20 available sites. Multiply that by 100% to get our percentage, and that gives us 95%. Okay, so that is 95% hemoglobin saturation. All right, coming back to the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, we now know what this y-axis value means, hemoglobin saturation. Now I want you to take a closer look at this curve and think about what it means. And I have these questions for you to consider in sort of interpreting this curve. So I want you to consider these questions. What happens to hemoglobin saturation as PO2 decreases in general? What happens if we go from these specific values, right? So what happens if we go from 90 to 70 millimeters of mercury? And then if we look at these other values, 50 to 30, what happens to PO2 there? Okay, so go ahead, hit pause, consider those questions, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so let's go over the answers to these questions. So hopefully you noticed, as we decrease PO2, right, as we go from higher to lower values in general, our hemoglobin saturation is going to fall. Hopefully that is not a surprise to you, okay? But now let's take a look at these specific values. As we go from 90, which is right here, to 70, which is right here, our hemoglobin saturation falls by a few percentage points, okay? So not a ton, okay? However, if we go from 50, which is right here, to 30, which is right here, so that's the same difference in pressure, right? So 20 millimeters of mercury difference. We have a much greater drop in hemoglobin saturation, okay? These differences have physiological implications. So at the top, like we just went over, this curve has a shallow slope. And that gives us a high oxygen carrying capacity, even at mid-range PO2 values, okay? And so that comes in handy because even if we have some problem with our ventilation where our alveolar PO2 is lower than normal, our hemoglobin is still going to be able to pick up that oxygen. It's still going to be mostly saturated, okay? Looking at the bottom part, middle bottom, this part with the steep slope allows easy offloading of oxygen to the tissues, right? So this is, I forgot to point out, but these values here, 40 is our PO2 at the tissues, and then 100 is our PO2 at the alveoli. So around this value, if we go down a little bit in PO2, that's going to free up a lot of oxygen, right? We're going to have less hemoglobin saturated, which means that oxygen is unbinding from hemoglobin. And that works out well because we need to release that oxygen to the tissues to use.